Hello everyone. So today I want to talk about the higher self, what it means to me, what I believe it represents, how to connect with it, etc, etc. I've had a lot of messages since my last video asking me to tackle this subject, so I thought I would. Now what follows is purely my perspective on things, nothing more, nothing less. I'm not claiming that any of this information is universal truth, it's just my truth, so it might not be yours. So yeah, just know that this is the egoic self musing on the idea of higher self. And it's always going to be hard to truly fathom and understand such a grand subject through the medium of egoic self. But I try, like we all do. I try to work these things out as best as I can. And so here are some of my thoughts. So to me, the higher self is true self. It's unedited and unfiltered self. There's no attachment with the higher self. It doesn't have worldly needs. It isn't attached to form. There's no ego there. It's totally free from ego. And really, the higher self is just pure consciousness. That's transcended the need for form. Or was it even at the point in the first place where it needed form? Possibly. It might have evolved to that state, or it might have just always been at that state. I'm not sure about that one. But either way, I'm pretty sure that the higher self is just pure consciousness. Free from ego. Totally unfiltered. You know, when I'm talking now, what I'm thinking and then saying is being filtered through this vehicle, this third dimensional vehicle. It's being filtered through the egoic self. But the higher self doesn't have a filter. It's just pure and raw. The higher self is like the all-encompassing aspect of self. It houses all selves under one roof. But yet it's more than a mere amalgamation of these selves. The higher self is greater than the sum of its parts. So even though it is your subconscious, and it is your superconscious, and it is your egoic conscious, and it's the higher dimensional aspects, and it's the lower dimensional aspects, it's all of these things, but yet it's so much more. Just as an example, this keyboard that's in front of me now is made up of billions, if not trillions of atoms. But yet when I look at it, I don't see those atoms. Even though fundamentally that is what this keyboard is. When I look at it, I see a keyboard. I don't see the atoms. I see something unique and distinct from the atoms, even though it is actually made of them. And the same applies with the higher self. The higher self is made up of all these singular aspects of self, but yet together, merged into one collective, that is the higher self, it suddenly becomes something totally different. It suddenly becomes more than just the sum of its parts. Because if the higher self was just a melting pot of selves, you know, you just bunged all the selves into a pot, melted them up, and there you go, that's higher self. It just wouldn't work very well. There'd be continual conflict within the higher self, because there'd still be these aspects of self going at one another. I think this, I think that, and there's a clash. But yet there is no clash. That doesn't happen. The higher self is totally unbiased and neutral in that respect. I almost see the higher self as like an overseer. It's aware of all aspects of self. It's connected to all aspects of self, but it's not attached to any of these aspects, and it doesn't associate with those aspects. In fact, I'm not sure if the higher self can really associate with anything or anyone. It's just beyond that. It's beyond association. Also, I see the higher self as like the bridge between egoic self, little old me, here and now, and universal consciousness and planetary consciousness. Therefore, through connecting with higher self, we can understand the totality of existence just that little bit better. Because it's like that connecting bridge, you know. I can't just tap straight into universal consciousness, or I can't just tap straight into the consciousness of the planet. But through connecting with higher self, your higher self can then make that connection. So it's like a middleman, in a sense. Yeah, and due to the higher self's all-encompassing perspective, it can give very broad insight. It's one step ahead of the game because it's got access to the entire picture, whereas egoic self has just got access to a sliver. So, you know, this is why communicating with higher self can be so beneficial, because it just has access to more than the egoic self. If we were to think of it like a hierarchy, I don't really see it as a hierarchy, but just as an example, let's see it as a hierarchy. The higher self, the highest self, is at the top of that hierarchy. So it's got a very, very lofty perspective on things. It's right at the top of the tower, so it can see down, and it can see all these things that you might not necessarily see down at ground level. And so this is why communicating with higher self can be so useful. It can be a great aid, and it can be very enlightening. You know, it's just the higher self presents great guidance, and if you use that guidance in the right way, it can really benefit your life in the third dimension as ego. You know. So I personally first communicated with my higher self in my early teens. I think I was about 13 or 14, and it first manifested literally in the form of a voice in my head. So obviously, you know, I questioned my sanity for a while, but in time I grew to realise what it was that was coming through. At first I wasn't too sure, but it didn't take long until I realised what it was. And I don't think I called it higher self back then, but I realised that it was just a deeper aspect of myself coming through. Now, one of the first things I noticed when this voice came through is that it was stemming from within me. Now, this is a real important point, because it made me realise that this was inner wisdom coming through. This was coming directly from me, here and now. You know. When looking for that higher aspect of yourself, don't expect it to be outside of yourself. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, in a sense. They look for wisdom and knowledge, they look for these more godly aspects of themselves outside. And I just don't think it works like that. I truly believe that the higher self, all aspects of self, are encapsulated in the here and now. It's all one thing, in a sense. It's all one thing. This isn't to say that within the illusion of reality, within the holographic illusion of the third dimension, that the higher self can't manifest outside of you to make an example, to make a point, or, you know, just to strengthen the connection you feel with it, because the ego connects more sometimes with things that it can see and, you know, and evaluate very much, you know, in a literal way, in a tangible way. So I'm not saying that the higher self can't pretend to be outside of you. It can, but really that is just illusion.